Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are all well and welcome again to the latest MEED webinar. This month, we are looking at the Middle East and Africa renewable energy projects market, a very interesting, fast-growing market indeed, looking at solar, wind power, as well as other technologies such as geothermal and waste to energy. My name is Edward James. I'm the head of content at MEED and MEED Projects, and I'll be your host today, giving a 30-minute or so presentation on the renewable energy projects market in the Middle East and Africa, and then taking your questions afterwards, should you have any. As ever, this presentation is being recorded and will be made available to you all, both online and on YouTube, and also in your inbox. Imminently, you should get the presentation itself now as well. So please take the chance to submit any questions you have in the Q&A box you see in your Zoom chat bar. And once this presentation is over, I'll have a go at answering them. Okay, so away we go. In the off chance that you don't know much about MEED, MEED is a business intelligence platform that's been around since 1957. We're comprised of two main platforms: MEED.com, our news, features and analysis service, which is updated daily in real time, as is MEED Projects, our projects tracking service of all major projects in the Middle East and Africa regions. And it's by tracking every project across different sectors that we are able to quantify what's happening in the markets and different sectors, as well as look at some of the opportunities and challenges. And indeed, most of the information and data that you receive today or look at today comes from these two platforms. So if you want to know more, please go and visit these websites and contact us, and we'd be more than happy to show you a demonstration of the value and intelligence that you can find on them. Again, just before I start on the presentation webinar itself, here you'll see some information about our forthcoming MEED Project Awards 2023 in association with Mashrek. So every year, MEED hosts an award ceremony to celebrate and recognize the top projects across different sectors and markets in the region. So if you have a project that has been completed in the last 18 months or so that you're really proud of, that you think is cutting edge and has been delivered very successfully, and you want to be recognized, then please enter your nominations for your project and a specific category. You can see you've got a QR code here. You've got some more information here if you want to enter, and then hopefully following the judging process, independent judging process, you'll be nominated for specific award category in your country of the project, and then hopefully also for the region as a whole. And then one last thing as well, if you'll permit me, this presentation and the data within it is a lot of it is taken from our Middle East and Africa Renewable Energy Projects Report, which is launching shortly. This is a 400-page plus PowerPoint-based report, very similar to what I'm presenting today, but with a lot more detail on a project-by-project basis. And for you attending today, there is a pre-launch offer and a special discount, which the details of which you can find here as well. Until the 12th of July, we're running this offer. So if you want a comprehensive and very thorough, up-to-date report, contact details and information on the Middle East and Africa renewable energy projects market, then please take a look at this report. You can find some sample content pages, table of contents and so forth following this scan and link here. So please do take a look at that. Okay, so let's kick off taking a look at the renewable energy projects market today. As in case any of you came late, this presentation is being recorded. You will have an opportunity to watch it again in your own time. And also you should have received by now already the presentation in PDF format in your inboxes. And also, finally, just to remind you all to submit any questions you might have in the Q&A chat box in the Zoom menu bar, and I'll take a chance to answer them later at the end of this. Okay, so I just thought I'd start off with something that some of you may and some of you may not know, which is looking at the renewable energy market historical context in the region. Now, actually, the world's first large-scale renewable energy project, solar project, was actually developed and built in the Middle East, in Egypt, more than a century ago. And you can see some images here. A 55 kilowatt solar power plant was developed to drive irrigation pumps in Maadi, which is just to the south of Cairo. And it was a big success at the time. Unfortunately, World War I came around and the project, larger scale project, was abandoned. However, just as we saw with railways last month, the Middle East actually has quite a deep history when it comes to renewable energy. So if anyone ever tells you, oh, the Middle East is late to renewable energy or is fairly new to the region, well, you can point this out that actually it's actually something that dates back a long, long time. In fact, was the first area in the world to experiment with solar power. Okay, so let's start off with clearly looking at the core data for renewable energy in the region. Now, most of this data is taken at the end of 2022. For some countries, though, it's taken at the end of 2021 because not all countries release their data at the same time, and some of them delay the release for a couple of years. Now, the GCC, this is all 2022 data, but for some of the other MENA markets, it's a little bit older than that. Now, we can see that on the left-hand column is about 32,000 megawatts of renewable energy installed capacity in the region, so 32 gigawatts, of which a little over half is in hydropower, and mainly as a result of legacy hydropower projects along the Euphrates and Tigris and Nile rivers, as well as in Iran, which has a lot of mountainous reservoirs which are used to create power from water. However, if you look at just solar, concentrated solar power wind, we've got about 14 gigawatts of renewable energy production. And that's against a total installed capacity, most of which is conventional fossil fueled power, of 408,000 megawatts or 408 gigawatts. So actually, renewable energy, despite all the investments made in recent years, is still only a fraction of the total energy mix, and it averaging about 7.9% when taking into account hydropower, and less than 3.5% when excluding hydropower. Now, that said, some countries perform a lot better than others. For example, Jordan and Morocco have a much higher base. More than a third of their electricity is coming from renewable energy sources, and this reflects, of course, that the fact that they are energy importers. They have little reserves of oil and gas, and therefore have been faster to uptake on the renewable energy side. On the other hand, some other markets have very minimal amount of electricity production from renewable energy. So 408 gigawatts overall in the MENA region, of which only 32 gigawatts is what one can classify as renewables. Now, contrast that with the renewable energy target set by each country. So you can see here we have some pretty ambitious targets by 2030, or some 2050 in some cases, or 2035 in others, between 10 and up to 50% of all electricity being produced by renewable energy by these years. So clearly, when compared with this very small numbers and compared with these numbers, targets, there's a lot of work to be done over the next 6 years or so. And indeed, even just basing it on the 2022 numbers of installed capacity, you can see here that there's an implication of some very, very substantial increases in renewable energy capacity over the next few years. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, 50% renewable energy capacity in the energy mix by 2030. If they've got 80,000 gigawatts today, if we exclude the fact that this is going to have to rise anyway as energy demand is rising, that implies at least 40 gigawatts of renewable energy by that period, 2030. Now, if we look here, you can see that just 842 megawatts of renewable energy capacity in the kingdom. So that implies that at least 39,000 megawatts or 39 gigawatts of solar and wind energy is required to be invested in over the next few years in the kingdom. So a long way to go and a lot of acceleration in renewable energy required. And indeed, this is why we are all here today and talking about this, because we're looking at tens of billions of dollars of investment required in building up renewable energy capacity. Now, we often talk about the GCC and North Africa when it comes to renewables, but I think it's just as important to note that there is an incredible amount of investment in renewable energy production in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, as we all know, the extent or provision of electricity in sub-Saharan Africa can be hit and miss. There are, in some countries, quite limited fossil fuel resources. Transmission distribution networks are limited. And indeed, for many countries, the renewable energy offers the potential to skip the conventional gas or oil-fired power stage and go straight to renewable energy. And indeed, that's what's being done, particularly in hydroelectricity and hydropower investments. Of course, in the Middle East, very few rivers and therefore very little investment in hydropower. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it's a completely different story. Some major rivers like the Niger, the Zambezi, the Congo, the Orange River and so forth, which offer fantastic potential for hydropower. And indeed, historically, that's where most of the investment in renewable energy has been. However, now looking forward, particularly in the area of solar energy, there is some really big investments ongoing and supported by big institutions like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and so on, that is really propelling the advance of renewable energy in the continent as well. And indeed, look, if you look at some of these the data points, most of the sub-Saharan African countries actually outdo the GCC and MENA region in terms of existing capacity. Of course, most of that is in hydroelectricity, as I mentioned, but in terms of current investments, for example, Angola, $4.7 billion of renewable energy investment already under execution, another $3.5 billion of known projects planned. Look at Ethiopia, the Grand Renaissance Dam, for example, 5.5 gigawatts of capacity and another $9.6 billion of investment required. So there's some big numbers coming into Africa as well. And I think, yes, there's a lot of focus on the GCC and MEED and North Africa markets, but sub-Saharan Africa also offers some really exciting opportunities. So in addition to these renewable energy targets, which have been set across many countries in line with the global greenhouse emission reduction goals, as well as big governmental initiatives from COP27, COP28, for example. There are other big major factors which are impacting the development of renewable energy across the regions. First of all is the fact that it's becoming increasingly cheaper to produce renewable energy, particularly solar power, when compared with gas-fired production. You can see that costs over the last decade have substantially fallen. And in many cases now, particularly in the GCC, where solar radiation levels are so high, it's actually becoming as cost efficient to build solar power production as it is to build fossil fuel fired production. And this, of course, is a big substantial driver for the development of renewable energy. And you can see that here, how costs levelized costs of electricity have declined for solar IPPs in the GCC, and you can see that there is a world record 1.35 cents per kilowatt hour recorded as the low bid tariff on the 2 gigawatt Al Dhafra Abu Dhabi IPP a couple of years back. Now, there's been a steady decline in costs. Now, this has been reversed somewhat over the last year or so due to higher EPC costs, higher logistics costs, and in cost inflation generally that we've seen around the world. Nonetheless, it's never been as cost effective to build renewable energy as it has been over the last 2 or 3 years or so. Now, why also are we seeing so much big investment in solar power in particular? Well, just taking Africa, and of course, this is the same picture for GCC. We've got massively high solar irradiation rates, some of the highest in the world, if not the highest in the world. And as you'll also obviously know, huge amounts of space as well, huge desert areas. So a large amount of space for the development of wind and solar power and a very high solar irradiation levels. So it makes a lot of sense combined with lower costs to build large scale solar complexes in the region. And so the Africa and GCC is perfectly placed for the development of solar energy in particular. And also for wind power too. You can see here that there are quite favorable wind profiles in North Africa in particular. And while wind is not particularly preferable along the Gulf Coast and the GCC, certainly along the Red Sea and in some of the mountainous areas of North Africa, it is very favorable indeed. And one last thing to mention, of course, in addition to solar, wind and hydropower, is that in countries like Ethiopia and Kenya, there is also and along the Rift Valley, there is very substantial geothermal energy potential as well. So the Middle East and Africa is really some of the best places in the world in order to develop renewable energy. And finally, as well, something that's sometimes overlooked is that, yes, of course, we've got global warming emissions, growing global greenhouse emissions and global warming generally, but there's also the economic impact of not building renewable energy. And I think sometimes this is overlooked, but also there's a very strong economic incentive for the countries of Africa and the GCC and the Middle East in general to invest in renewable energy. In places like some of the poorer nations of Africa, it means they don't need to spend money on importing expensive oil and gas. And of course, they can benefit from more localized energy production, which in turn can help with the provision and extensional provision of electricity to more remote areas as well. So many benefits and advantages for the development of renewable energy in the region, and one of the reasons why we've seen so much acceleration in renewable energy projects in the region. Talking of which, let's look at those in more detail. Before I go on, though, just to mention, this is being recorded. You should have received a copy of this presentation in your inbox already. And please also take the opportunity to submit your questions in the Zoom box. I will get round to answering them in a bit. So let's just talk about investment in renewable energy over the last few years in Middle East and Africa. As you can see, there has been a trend of increasing amounts of investment over the last 13 years or so, just $3 billion of investment in renewable energy production in 2010-11. However, this has grown to hit a peak of $15 billion in 2015, and then $13 billion in 17-18, $11 billion in 21-2022. Now, interestingly, as of mid-June this year, we've already hit $9.9 billion of investment in renewable energy projects in the Middle East and Africa, which indicates on a pro rata basis that we will see a record amount of investment this year, upwards of $20 billion. So we are likely entering a new paradigm for renewable energy. We're entering a period where almost all new electricity production projects are in the form of solar or wind energy. And these numbers, as a result, are just going to grow and grow. Now, in terms of the biggest spenders over the last 13 years, this graph shows you where the spending has been. And you can see that actually the largest market in terms of renewable energy spending has been in South Africa, more than $15 billion awarded over the last decade and a half or so. Many of you who've maybe been looking at South Africa will have noted that there is a massive shortfall in supply of electricity. There are rolling blackouts across the country. And as a result, Eskom, the state energy utility, has tendered to the market alongside the government a number of major renewable energy projects to be developed by the private sector. And this is already being felt by some very steep increases in contract awards, and has meant that South Africa is the leader in terms of renewable energy contracts over the last few years. Then we have Saudi Arabia, which was a bit late to the renewable energy party, but has already really embraced renewable energy, has recently awarded 3 massive solar power plants, which we'll look at in a bit this year alone, and is embarking now on 3 major wind projects as well, and indeed has some of the world's largest renewable energy projects. As has Egypt, unlike the GCC, has a large number of wind projects either awarded or operational, as well as solar power plants along the Red Sea coast and in the southern parts of the country. And then we have also the UAE. So these 3 markets in the MENA region are probably the largest. The UAE, of course, has some of the world's largest solar power projects, some of the cheapest as well. In the Mohammed bin Rashid solar park in Dubai, we've got the world's largest single-site solar power complex. And we also mustn't forget Morocco, which has one of the highest energy mixes for renewable energy in the region, has more than 1/3 of all power produced from solar and wind energy. So these 4 markets, I would say, are the leading countries in the MENA region. We then have obviously South Africa and Africa, Zambia, Angola, and Ethiopia, and so on, particularly in hydropower, which have also invested large amounts over recent years, supported by international financing agencies like the World Bank and African Development Bank, and so on. So a lot of investment across many different countries. And indeed, here we're breaking down this investment by types of project. Now, you can see here the darker brown is hydropower, and you can see up to about 2018, hydropower was the largest single segment of spending. But we've seen in the last 5 years or so how solar power has really overtaken hydropower as the #1 investment of choice in terms of technologies used. Other technologies, wind, it has some ups and downs, but it's still a small portion of overall investment. Compared to solar. We've seen some waste to energy in recent years, not very much, and geothermal is quite small. But in recent years, it's really all been about solar power. And indeed, here you can see that solar energy is comprised about 45% or $57 billion of total investment in renewable energy projects in the Middle East and Africa over the last 13 years or so, followed by hydropower, 36% or $46 billion, then wind power, $18.5 billion and 15%, and waste energy and geothermal making up quite small components of that mix. And then in terms of the geographical distribution of historical contract awards, you can see here that it's fairly well spread across different parts of the Middle East and Africa. East Africa, so that's Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, Somalia, Kenya, and so on, about $27 billion of investment. A lot of that is, of course, in the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, so about 22% of all investment. Within the GCC, catching up, $27 billion, about 1/5 of total investment in renewable energy. Rest of the Middle East, $8.3 billion. The North African states, primarily Egypt and Morocco, some $23 billion. Southern Africa, and then West Africa and Central Africa. Now, in terms of projects under execution, currently, as you can see here, we've got some let me see, 40, 50, 70, 80, $90 billion of projects under execution today. Again, East Africa is the largest chunk, about 27%, a quarter of that, $20 billion. And the GCC, another quarter, $19 billion. Middle East, North Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa. But again, a nice diversified split. And so renewable energy is really investment is really taking place across the Middle East and Africa, and is not necessarily in one single area. Now, in terms of projects under execution and where they are, you can see here that the largest chunk of spending currently is actually in Saudi Arabia. As I mentioned, large number of solar energy projects awarded. Also, we've got one of the world's largest renewable energy projects for the captive hydrogen power plant in NEOM, 4 gigawatts there. But you can see here more than $12 billion of projects contracted under construction in Saudi Arabia. And we then have Egypt, more than $6 billion, the UAE, nearly $6 billion, and Zambia, Angola, South Africa, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Morocco, and so on. So some very major, substantial investments, again, across many different countries, very diversified and very exciting right now. So if you are focused purely on the GCC, you should perhaps also take a look at the Sub-Saharan Africa market too. Not of these projects are underwritten and guaranteed or funded by international agencies like the World Bank, African Development Bank, the EBRD, the EIB in Europe, and so on, and are fairly secure in terms of their financing. So again, some very interesting markets in Sub-Saharan Africa too. Now, in terms of the key projects currently underway, under construction, you can get an idea of some of those. Got the values, the award years, the capacities. You've got things like the 2 gigawatt Kakula Kabasa hydroelectric power plant, Angola, the Batoka hydroelectric plant in Zambia. As I mentioned, we've got the Green Fuels project for NEOM, Green Hydrogen Company, NEOM. We've got the CSP project, 950 megawatts for Noor Energy One, special purpose vehicle in Dubai, the Rafiji hydroelectric plant in Tanzania, Shreba 2, the hydropower plant in Ataka, pump storage in Egypt, and so on. I won't go through them, but you've got some very substantial power projects indeed. A lot of them are on IPPs, developed and financed by the private sector. And as you can see, a mix mainly between hydropower and solar power production. In terms of recent contract awards to look at, well, the three perhaps critical ones we've seen very recently are the Al Ras 2, the Al Khafa, and the Saad 2 solar IPPs in Saudi Arabia. They were tendered by the Saudi Power Procurement Company, the SPPC, and won by a JV of Aqua Power and Badil, which is a subsidiary of the PIF. So these have been recently awarded. The Saad 2 EPC contract has already been awarded to SEPCO 3, and we're waiting for news on the EPC contracts for the Al Ras 2 and Al Khafa projects. We've also got recent contract award for 750 megawatt power solar plant in Iraq, the Mana 1 and 2 IPPs in Oman, the Wadi Al Dawaser solar power plant in Saudi Arabia, the Mpumalanga wind farm in South Africa, and a range of other different types of power projects in different countries. So a lot of work and activity already awarded this year. And in terms of the leading contractors, in terms of work under execution, well, Chinese contractors tend to dominate, particularly in the solar sector. Obviously, China is one of the major producers of solar panels, has some excellent technology when it comes to solar power, and very cost competitive when it comes to EPC as well. So we have companies like Sino Hydro, particularly in the hydroelectric side, China Gazuba, CEC, Shanghai Electric, SEPCO 3, Power China, and so on, very strong in the renewable energy space. We also have LNT, which is building the NEOM hydrogen power complex, renewable energy element. We've also got WeBuild of Italy involved in pump storage and hydroelectric projects as well. TSK of Spain, strong player in solar power, and then Egyptian contractors like El Suwaidi and the Arab contractors as well. So quite a diversified mix of contractors there. And then just in terms of developers, taking a look at the GCC, we can see here that in terms of both gross and net equity capacity, ACWA Power is by far and away the leading developer for renewable energies in the GCC region, followed by China's Jinko, then France's EDF, the GIC, based out of Kuwait, Mazda, of course, the Abu Dhabi Renewable Energy Agency, Japan's Marubeni, and so on. But this list is growing. Increasing number of companies in the region themselves are diversifying into becoming not just contractors, but renewable energy and power in general developers. And given that almost all new renewable energy capacity is being developed on a IPP basis with private developers, then this list and these numbers are going to grow certainly over time. In terms of the future market, well, currently we are aware of just over $290 billion of known, planned and unawarded renewable energy projects in the Middle East and Africa. Just over half are solar power projects, mainly PV, more than 53% of those. We then have a quarter wind power projects, 27%, 15% hydropower projects, and then geothermal and waste to energy making up the remainder. So the big difference here really is the fact that wind power is going to overtake hydropower projects generally in terms of the future mix. And then in terms of the current situation, we have approximately $24 billion of renewable energy projects in bid evaluation, $6.1 billion out to bid, and $9 billion in pre-qualification stage. We've got $33 billion in FEED and $218 billion, 75% of the pipeline in the study stage still. So a huge future market. Over the last 13 years, we've seen approximately $127 billion of renewable energy projects awarded, and we've got $291 billion in the pipeline. So we've got more than double the previous decade's worth of projects in that pipeline. So at least a doubling of the projects market expected over the next decade or so. And certainly that is in line with the targets set by the different geographies in the Middle East and Africa, and indeed is not going to be sufficient to meet those targets. So this number, $291 billion, is really expected to grow over the coming months and years ahead. In terms of the geographical breakdown of this pipeline, well, again, we've got in a very diversified and broadly even mix. We've got $64 billion of known projects coming up in North Africa, mainly Egypt, Morocco. Algeria too wants to come and get on the act. $57 billion in East Africa, $52 billion in the GCC, and $55 billion in West Africa. So again, a very broad mix of geographical diversification of spending in renewable energy. Every part of the Middle East and Africa, every country is embarking full steam ahead with the development of renewable energies. Likewise, in terms of the percentage breakdown, well, it matches, as you can see the figures here, but the largest single segment is North Africa, about just over a fifth, of all known future project spending, and then roughly a fifth each between the GCC, East Africa, and West Africa. I see we've already got 13 questions in the quick Q&A box. Keep it coming, and I will try to answer those at the end of this presentation. Now, in terms of the key projects currently out in the market to bid, here you can see some of the selected ones. We've got some big hydroelectric projects, Mpanda Nukua hydroelectric power plant, IPP in Mozambique. We've got the Window 6 for South Africa, some 4 gigawatts of different smaller scale power projects planned there. We've got PV4 starting to be tendered in Abu Dhabi. Of course, we've got the Al Ajban solar IPP, where bids were submitted a little while back. We've got the Al Hinakia solar IPP in Saudi Arabia, Yanbu Wind. As I mentioned, there are 3 big wind power projects right now out to bid through in SPPC in Saudi Arabia, like Al Gat, for example, and a range of other big projects across the Middle East and Africa. You can see some of the award dates, the clients, and the status of these projects. Now, longer term, what have we got? Well, we've got some very major world-scale solar, renewable energy, hydro and wind power projects coming up. Some of the largest ones are projects like Project Amman and Amun in Mauritania, Morocco, which are really focused on providing captive power for some very large-scale hydrogen power plants. But we've also got solar power plants aimed at transmitting electricity directly to Europe from Morocco. We've got green hydrogen hubs in Southern Africa, Djibouti. We've got huge an MOU signed recently for a 5 gigawatt wind farm in Egypt, more hydropower projects, and some very large substantial projects indeed. Of course, this is just a selection of them, some of the largest ones, and you can see some very large major investments required. Again, a very diversified mix, different types of technology, different countries, and a very exciting pipeline indeed. And if there's one thing, a trend that we're noticing is that the projects are getting bigger. And then finally, just to end up, just looking at 2 quite interesting projects at the moment in either in the market or under construction. The first is the first of its kind in the GCC, which is the Hatta 250 megawatt pump storage plant under construction right now in Hatta in the Dubai Emirate. This is a $400 million contract, basically to essentially build 2 reservoirs and use gravity to drive turbines, and then pump the water back up to the higher reservoir during lower peak periods, for example, at night. So it's kind of like, it's almost akin to a battery storage facility. So we've got Strabag, Andritz, and Oscar building this on an EPC basis for DEWA, and it's likely to be the first of its kind to be embarked on in the GCC. There are a couple of pump storage plants in Morocco, but otherwise it's fairly unique in the region. And indeed, SEC in Saudi Arabia is now looking at the same in some of the more mountainous areas of building similar type projects. Here we got the reservoir up here in Hatta, as you can see, work underway, and using the natural topography in Hatta to build this project, which should be completed early next year. And to monetize the project, DEWA are also going to be building a hotel and connected by to sea level by cable car at the top of the reservoir to make the most of the investment opportunity. In terms of just an idea of terms of how to register for utilities for some of these big projects, vendors, developers, and so on can register with DEWA individually. Here are some of the instructions and the links to pre-qualify DEWA for future projects for its next phases of solar power complexes at the Mohammed bin Rashid Solar Park, for example. And indeed, generally speaking, procurement or registration with each of the developers needs to be done on an individual basis through the websites of each of the major developers. Now, of course, in the region, we're talking about 70 plus countries, each with their own utilities and power and water developers. So there is quite a lot of registration required. Nonetheless, it's becoming increasingly straightforward to register with the utilities and to pre-qualify and receive tender documentation for renewable energy projects, or indeed any other project that they procure. As I mentioned, there are three major solar power projects recently awarded in Saudi Arabia, with a total of about 4.55 gigawatts of capacity. These are at Saad 2, Al Khafa, and Al Ras 2 in the kingdom. As you can see, one is in Riyadh, one is in Mecca, one is Al Qasim. The client is the state-owned Saudi Power Procurement Company, better known as the SPPC, and the project sponsors are the winners of these, the developers for these projects, who will be responsible for financing, building and operating the projects over 35 years. The power purchase agreement is for 35 years. Bedil, the Water Electricity Holding Company, which is a subsidiary of PIF, and Power, which is also part owned by the Saudi government. And tender type was build operate, and they were all recently awarded with a completion targeted for early 2026. As I mentioned earlier, SEPCO 3, the Chinese contractor, is EPC for Saad 2, while we're waiting for news on the EPC contractors for the other two IPPs, as well as financial close being reached. So again, a little bit more of a summary of these three projects, and indeed these are just the first of a number of big IPPs tendered by SPPC this year. We've also got three wind IPPs currently in the market, Awad Shamal and Al Gat, included on them, and Saudi Arabia, after a slow start, is really catching up fast in terms of the development of renewable energy in line with its targets. Another example with SPPC on how to pre-qualify with them. You can visit their website and go through all the documentation and submit all the various registration requirements and papers and documents in order to make sure that you can participate in their tenders. Okay, so just a reminder before I go on to the Q&A that all this information and a lot more individual project details similar to what you've just seen, contact details, a huge amount of data on a country-by-country basis is available in our 400-page plus Middle East and Africa Renewable Energy Projects Report. If you are interested at all in any aspect of the renewable energy projects market, then this is a must-have report, which can really help you in target and win renewable energy project opportunities across the Middle East and Africa. If you want to know more about this, see the table of contents, sample pages, and so on, please scan this QR code. Okay, and as I mentioned, there's also a pre-launch offer and a discount code if you're interested. Just need to purchase the report before 12th of July. It's well worth it, I can assure you. Now, just before we go on to the Q&A, I believe we have a quick poll question. If you could please tick yes or no. The question is, would you like us to contact you to understand how MEED can support your business? If you can just click yes or no, I'll be very grateful. And then we can go on to answer the questions. Okay. So once you've answered that, I'll now answer some of your questions. I can see we've got more than 20 questions, so I will do my best now to answer them. Okay, first question is, why is nobody talking about transmission grid reliability drawbacks and challenges due to energy mix? Okay, so I'm assuming this is talking about the fact that renewable energy by its nature can sometimes be intermittent. Obviously, it's difficult. You can't produce solar energy at night. If there's no wind, it's difficult to produce wind energy. And clearly there are concerns that if you develop or your mix of electricity is too much towards renewable energy, you might encounter challenges when these kind of situations arise. So there has been a big investment in diversifying the both geographical and technology mix. So there's both wind energy investments and solar energy investments, for example, in the GCC. But there's also now an increasing amount of investment in battery storage facilities. If you look at the like NEOM, the Red Sea Global Giga Project on the Red Sea coast, which are going to be reliant on off-grid provide renewable energy, then there is also substantial investment in battery storage to cover for lower supply periods. So that's certainly something that is being looked at as well. And indeed, when you're looking at investments in, for example, nuclear energy, a lot of that is to provide that more consistent baseload energy requirements to support the development of renewable energy as well. And indeed, projects like pump storage, which kind of act as battery storage anyway, are also being developed to assist with that. Nonetheless, it's true that there will still have to be a fair amount of, for the foreseeable future, of conventional fired baseload capacity to accommodate any shortfalls in renewable energy production when conditions are not favorable. So it's one of the things I haven't talked about. It's a question here about hydrogen production. So I haven't really spoken about or referred to non-utility capacity of renewable energy. And some of these figures, the figures that we've gone through in this data in the presentation today, are mainly for utility grid connected capacity. There is, in addition, a huge amount of investment going to be made in captive renewable energy production for hydrogen power production, green hydrogen energy power production, and which will require tens of thousands of investment in solar and wind power production, particularly in places like Morocco, Mauritania, Namibia, Oman, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And the reason I haven't included it or gone through it in this particular webinar is because I've covered it in previous webinars and reports on hydrogen. So we're looking mainly at the utility capacity. But yes, for sure, if we included renewable energy projects for captive projects for hydrogen, then the numbers we're talking about today are far, far higher indeed. But please refer to the hydrogen report and my previous hydrogen webinar, which you can find on MEED projects and online on YouTube to get more information about those. What type of solar technology fits more in the Middle East, where the temperature is higher than 40 degrees centigrade, even in shade areas? So generally speaking, the trend now is very firmly toward PV, solar PV technology. 10 years ago, there was much more talk about CSP and indeed integrated solar combined cycle. But due to lower costs, it's the PV is now firmly entrenched as the solar technology of choice in the region. Indeed, if you look at the majority of renewable energy projects in the solar space going forward, they are almost all nearly in the form of solar PV. I know nuclear energy is not renewables, but what's the level of interest for nuclear in the Middle East? So in the Middle East, there is, well, depending on your definition of the Middle East, there are two active nuclear power projects. One is in Iran, which was the first, and the second one is in the UAE, now Baraka, which came on stream over the last 2 or 3 years. And then we are also seeing the construction of a nuclear power plant at El Daba on the Egyptian north coast as well. We've also got a nuclear power plant, one nuclear power plant in South Africa too. So nuclear energy has been pretty slow in the region. I mean, the region's got always traditionally had a lot of oil and gas, so there was less incentive to develop a nuclear power industry. This is slowly changing, and one can see that the likelihood is that we'll see a nuclear power program be launched in Saudi Arabia over the next 18 months or so. However, other than that, and the expansion of nuclear power capacity in Iran, there isn't so much conversation about nuclear energy in other markets so far. And indeed, with the advances in renewable energy, it can be argued that it has lowered the requirement generally for nuclear power production in the region. Do you expect any of the Middle East countries will achieve their renewable energy targets before 2035? So let's just go back to these targets. Okay, so we've got Morocco, 52% by 2030 is the highest. We've got Jordan, 30% by 2030, 50% in Saudi Arabia, 50% UAE, for example, and the implied minimum capacities that will need to be there before then. Now, if we look at the actual amount of installed capacity at the moment, only Jordan and Morocco really are in double figures, and realistically, these are the two most likely to hit their targets. It's very difficult, given the sheer amount of capacity required for objectively for one to be able to see these targets being met. It would require a huge amount of decommissioning of aging or existing capacity and a huge amount of investment in new renewable energy capacity. And you're looking at 5 gigawatts a year of new capacity to be built over the next 4 or 5 years. It's difficult to really see that happening in some markets. It might be achievable, but I think it's going to be very, very difficult. What do you mean by projects under execution? Projects under execution, I mean where the contract has been awarded either in an EPC basis to the contractor or on an IPP BOT basis to a developer. In terms of projects in Oman, well, we've got recently the award of the Mana 1 and 2 solar IPPs, which are the main renewable energy projects right now. I've got some questions which are quite technical in nature. For example, the payback period on a PV plant and the average capex cost now for wind and solar PV project. If you look at this table here that I've done, you can see some of the lowering costs per kilowatt hour, as well as some of the tariffs submitted, which can give you an idea when broken down, take into account financing, EPC costs, operations and maintenance costs, can help you make a rough estimate for the overall IRR and payback and capex on these projects. Do we have a demand supply projection till 2030, 2050 to understand if we would head into a surplus, as happened in a few countries in the past? So by surplus, you mean where supply is far in excess of demand. Historically in the Middle East, this has very rarely happened. The last decade or so, demand for electricity has really grown very rapidly, and indeed has often outpaced supply. So one of the reasons, for example, the UAE built the nuclear power plant was to be able to provide that extra reserve capacity for when required. However, there are a number of options or tools at the different countries' disposal. For example, increasing tariffs, a lot of subsidized electricity rates. Increasing tariffs in the past has proven to be very effective in lowering future demand rates. And the forecasting for future demand in the Middle East has got a lot better than in the past. So there's pretty good, steady pipeline of projects coming to market using the private sector, which has meant that it's difficult to foresee supply overtaking demand. However, it's also difficult to see supply far outstripping demand in the near future either. So it's always a tricky balance, but it's something that the region has been quite effective at doing. Of course, when you go into sub-Saharan Africa, it's a quite different story where, of course, potential demand far outstrips in many countries the supply. And renewable energy offers a way of beating this trilemma by getting the private sector financing involved, but by being able to build more localized renewable energy production, for example, solar power projects which don't need to be dependent on a grid to feed other parts of a country and can serve local areas. So renewable energy offers a good solution for many of those sub-Saharan states. Is there a plan to make a similar webinar for conventional projects soon? And if yes, when? So we are going to be doing later this year a conventional MENA power report looking at fossil fuel gas-fired power production, and watch this space for a webinar around that. Do you have more information on pump storage projects and hydropower around in per country. Yes, we do, and indeed this report will outline all of those pump storage power projects, hydropower projects, and indeed all hydropower projects in the Middle East and Africa. In the Middle East and North Africa, there are very few pump storage projects, obviously, because there's very few little water resources, but UAE is the first in the GCC to have a pump storage project. Iran has a few, Egypt is building one at Attaka, and Morocco has a couple as well, but otherwise very rarely used in the region. In many cases, because there aren't the mountainous areas for it to be utilized, but also simply because there isn't enough water resources to make it work. Is the download free of charge? Well, my colleague is going to answer that. She's writing an answer right now, so you'll be able to see the answer to that. But yes, you should have already received this presentation in your inbox, but it's also been recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube for you to look at in your own time. How much of a role will small PV projects play in sub-Saharan Africa, as far as you know? Small PV projects, let's say below 10 megawatts, are going to play a very important role in sub-Saharan Africa. As I mentioned already, you've got a lot of remote areas in a lot of these countries without any electricity provision at all. And rather than having to build massive, very large utility-scale power plants, gas-fired, oil-fired, and then building expensive transmission networks to service these areas, you can build much smaller scale solar power projects or wind power projects in a more localized manner. So this is something that's being built very fast. I think it's important to recognize in sub-Saharan Africa an important point that it is a market dominated by Chinese contractors, and that's, I think, an important point to bear in mind. However, we are seeing an increasing number of these projects financed and supported by World Bank, the European Investment Bank, African Development Bank, and so on, which does make them a lot more secure in terms of their financing and viability. Okay, so question here, actually following on from what I just said about how most of the renewable energy projects are being financed by the private sector, by local international banks, and what are the risks, or what role do you think the capital markets will play in financing such projects, given the construction risk on developing them? So I think it's important to bear in mind that one of the reasons why IPPs, IWPPs have been so successful in the region is that we've got a long track record since the late 1990s of developing power through the private sector in the Middle East. And the reason for that is twofold, really. In terms of fuel supply, whether it's gas or oil or diesel, the government has always been able to guarantee that. And in terms of offtake, the government has always historically been able to guarantee the offtake on a take or pay basis. So in terms of the demand and the supply of feedstock, that's been very low risk. And one of the reasons why banks and financial institutions have been very happy to support projects at quite low rates. Of course, interest rates are rising, so the cost of debt is also increasing, and that is having an impact on some of the tariffs that we're seeing coming through, alongside higher EPC and technology costs and panel costs, logistics costs, which are affecting some of the project pricings. Nonetheless, it's still an area which is viewed very favorably by the project financing community, simply because of the low financial risk. Now, construction risk is always a valid concern. However, for developers, they're normally passing on this risk to the EPC contractor, and generally it's the EPC contractor that essentially takes on a lot of that construction risk. This is something that's accommodated for in higher EPC costs, for example. And then in terms of operations, we have seen over the years some challenges around, for example, dust collection or so lower irradiation levels than anticipated on some of these solar power projects. But with increasing number of references and understanding of the market and some of the conditions around most of these issues are being overcome. So in terms of financing, yes, financing costs have grown, but it's still a very viable opportunity indeed. Are the GCC projects going to be linked to GCC interconnection project? There's been a large number of investments recently by the GCCIA in new substations and high voltage overhead lines. We've got now connections linking up with Iraq, and also from Saudi Arabia into Egypt. And the plan is to be able to increase the amount of electricity to be transmitted and commercially available between different GCC states and beyond. Now, the electricity shared between the GCC states tends to be from grids rather than specific power plants. So any power production that's added to the mix from a renewable energy side will simply be added to that pool of electricity that's available to be sold. Now, what the GCCI or GCC interconnected grid allows is that it allows for, in the conditions where renewable energy becomes slightly inconsistent, then it allows obviously countries to be able to draw on a neighboring country to supply it with a short-term supply of electricity to cover those shortfalls. So it is another security mechanism that helps the development of renewable energy generally. And of course, if you look at North Africa, now there are a number of big electricity interconnection projects underway, for example, between Egypt and Cyprus, Egypt and Europe, Morocco and Europe and so on, that increasingly also opens up the potential for large-scale solar power projects to be built in North Africa to provide electricity directly to Europe, particularly in taking into account the Russia-Ukraine crisis and potential alternative source of electricity in North Africa. Supply chain constraints, of course, we've seen different cycles in solar power panels, availability and costs. The market was flooded with cheap solar panels for a while, which created big disturbances in the market. Solar panel costs right now are growing again due to the higher logistics costs, which in turn results in increase in EPC and development costs. Just as in hydrogen and electrolyzers, we may well see some shortfall in availability of the supply chain and solar panels, for example, that might have an impact on the development of renewable energy as well. So it's certainly something that when we are looking at a massive pipeline of renewable energy, then it's also something that certainly has to be taken into account and mitigated against. Okay, so running out of time now. Question here is slightly off topic, which is about ammonia instead of fuel, oil, or gas for power plants. Green hydrogen to produce green ammonia, or just hydrogen generally to drive power plants, is definitely something that's on the cards. And indeed, if you look at most of the gas turbines currently in the region, they can utilize their dual fuel. They can also use hydrogen instead of natural gas. And indeed, that is something that's been actively explored. It's still a little way off in terms of the pipeline, but this is something I expect we'll see emerge more and more over the next couple of years. And indeed, please reference my hydrogen projects webinar for more analysis on that. A lot of questions about hydrogen, and again, I would go, if you can, go onto YouTube, type in MEED hydrogen projects webinar, and you'll get a much more in-depth overview of hydrogen projects and green ammonia projects in the region. Okay, so we've got one last question I'll take. Well, a couple last questions. There's a question about hydrogen in Namibia. Why is Namibia planning a large hydrogen project? If you look at some of these countries, why they're planning hydrogen projects, it's because they have huge amounts of empty space and they've got very high solar radiation levels. And that means you can produce hydrogen more cheaply than anywhere else in the world. And at scale, you can become a leader in green hydrogen production, which you can then export directly as hydrogen or as green ammonia to other markets which need fuel sources, and you can produce electricity conventionally with these green sources of energy. And that's why countries like Namibia, huge space, large, high solar radiation levels, Morocco too, Oman, Saudi Arabia, these are why they're all developing hydrogen projects. So hopefully that answers that question. And then we've got a final question about solar rooftop, and I haven't everything today you've seen excludes solar rooftop. There are issues generally about and something that tends to be overlooked is feed-in tariffs and the use of solar rooftop panels to feed into the grids. And generally speaking, in the GCC, this is not something that is often undertaken. There are limits on the amount of electricity that can be supplied to the grid. We have centralized utilities that tend to build large utility scale projects, tend to be owned directly by the government, and therefore the market doesn't tend to be very fragmented or very liberalized to allow for that mechanism of two-way flow of electricity. So when we do see solar rooftop, it tends to be captive for particular location or scenario. So a warehouse solar rooftop plant, rooftop panels, a car park solar rooftop shading facility, and so on. But generally speaking, if you go to the GCC, for example, you'll see very few properties or houses with solar rooftop. Certainly, it's an area that can be developed, but there are certain grid utility challenges to overcome to make that work. There is no charge for this presentation, so it's totally free of charge. You should have already received it. If you registered for this presentation, you should have received this presentation in your inbox. As I mentioned, it's also being recorded and you'll be able to watch it again on YouTube next week. Okay, so that's it for me. Thank you very much for your questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to answer all of them, but we had more than 500 people online today, which shows just how much interest there is in renewable energy projects in the Middle East and Africa. Please take a look at this report and look at what it can help, how it can help you, and help you win business in this industry and space. And I look forward to seeing you hopefully very soon with our next webinar on a different topic. Again, thank you for your attention. This is my email address, my contact details. If you want to email me or contact me at any time, then please do so. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure again to be able to present to you. I hope you found it valuable and useful. I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you. Goodbye.